Administrative report, charter update. Mr. Callahan, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Liz. If you could help me out with the PowerPoint, please. There are just a few slides, so it won't be much. So this item came about at the request of council members last year, and at the mayor's direction, a subcommittee of the council was formed, comprised of Councilmembers De La Rosa, Craig, and Villegas, to consider whether or not there should be amendments to the charter. And so as a result of those discussions, and there were a couple of meetings that were held, and unfortunately we couldn't get all three subcommittee members together for either of those meetings, but I understand that there were discussions among the members of the subcommittee. There are a few items that came up during those discussions, the first being the mayor's term. And as it's currently codified in the charter, the mayor serves a 2-year term. And so every 2 years there's an election of the mayor. The discussion at the subcommittee level was whether or not to extend that mayoral term to 4 years as opposed to 2 years. And on each of these items, I'll allow the subcommittee members, or invite them rather, to provide their own specific comments about each of these items. The second was council member term limits. And currently there are no term limits for the council members. You can serve as long as the voters in your district will allow you to. So the discussion that came up during those subcommittee discussions was whether to establish term limits that would be in effect a 12-year term limit for council members. You could serve 3 4-year terms. And the discussion was that it wouldn't apply to sitting council members until this next election cycle in 2018 and the one in 2020, such as if you were a sitting council member, you wouldn't be subject to that 12-year term until the next election cycle, so that you could serve 12 more terms regardless of how many terms you've served currently. The third item was council member compensation. The last time that compensation was considered at the city council level was back in 1985. The limit on council member compensation is currently tied to state law. As a charter city, you have the ability to change that. It would require a change to your charter and a change to the city code to allow you to get additional compensation. I did put a couple of examples of what some other cities have done in that respect for part-time council members. Performance standards for council members came up, and this was more of a discussion around report cards, because neither the city manager nor myself police council members as employees. There really is no mechanism to do that. You have your rules of decorum, which regulate how you behave in public and at these council meetings. So this was more of a discussion around putting a report card on the city's website in terms of your attendance at regional meetings, your attendance at council meetings, and that sort of thing. And so there really is no recommendation for a charter amendment in this regard. This is something that could be handled administratively or at the ordinance level. And the last item is something that this council can't control, but I know that has engendered a lot of discussion, particularly as of late, and this is Charter Section 18.4, binding interest arbitration for your firefighters. Now, this came about as voter initiative several years ago, and because it was put into your charter by the voters, there isn't anything that the city council can do about it. You can't put this on the ballot for the voters to remove from your charter, but it is something that the community can bring forward if they're really interested in this. You'll have to gather enough signatures and put it on the ballot for voter consideration. But again, this is something that the council cannot, on its own motion, put forward before the voters, but is something that has come up in several conversations. And so moving on to the next slide, please, Liz. There is a provision in state law that says you cannot amend your charter unless it's part of a statewide general election. So for our purposes, that would be 2018. So if you want to have any issue put before the voters for your charter, it would have to be presented to the voter, the registrar of voters in August, which means we'd have to have 2 public hearings at the next 2 council meetings in order to get sufficient input to put something forward for the November ballot. It's a very, very tight time frame, but it's something that could be done if the council chooses to do so. Or 2020 would be your next opportunity, and of course there'd be sufficient time to do that. We couldn't do it next year. It has to be at a statewide general election. So on those several items, this is just a discussion. There's no action that's going to be taken, and so we'll hopefully go council member by council member and get your comments on each of these different items, because if there is consensus on any of these, we'll have to put something together really quickly and bring it back for your next council meeting for action to put something forward to the voters. And so, Mr. Mayor, you may want to start with the members of the subcommittee to get their input. But that's all I have for you tonight, and I'm available for questions.
Councilwoman Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Callahan. I appreciate it. So we have been working for the last several years on charter amendment updates and changing language and trying to figure out what needs to be cleaned up. The charter is essentially the rules and regulations of the city. And so I took an interest in it when I was first elected in terms of some of the things that, you know, it's sort of the bylaws of the city a little bit. The discussions that we had, and I know as Mr. Callahan alluded, we had not a full group at either meeting, but we did have 100% participation in some capacity at each meeting. So I know that sounds vague, but all 3 subcommittee members did participate in the discussion. I guess with permission from the mayor, if I could just go through the issues and touch on each one of them, I think that's probably the best way to manage it. We're not
Please,
doing...
and then we'll go to the other subcommittee members, then to the rest of the council.
Okay. Are we doing questions, or are you just asking for recap or method to the madness or something along those lines?
Well, you're developing the material for
Got
our
it.
questions.
Understood.
So.
Okay. We discussed the mayoral term, which has kind of come and gone ever since Mayor Donahue was in place. The chamber took it on initially as a 4-year, they wanted to go from a 2-year term to a 4-year term. It is something that in theory makes sense because you have a mayor who's in office for a year and then he has to run for re-election, and then he's in office for a year and then he has to run for re-election. But actually one of the individuals earlier in public comment made a point that in a case where you have a mayor for every 2 years, or running for re-election every 2 years, it balances out the council because 3 of us are elected every 2 years, every 4 years, and the other 3 are elected every 4 years. So, for instance, 3 of us are up for re-election in 2018, and there are 3 that are up for re-election in 2020. So we felt like, and particularly without, you know, trying to ask the mayor or anything along those lines of what his political plans are, we wanted to be conscientious of the fact that we have a mayor in the middle of his term. And I don't know, have you announced you're running for re-election yet? Either way, the intent is really to make these decisions for long-term purposes. And so the subcommittee decided not to address that 2-year term or to attempt to change it. The council member term limits came as part of a discussion with Councilmember Villegas and Councilmember De La Rosa, but at different meetings. And we had talked about some of the issues with term limits versus some of the benefits of term limits. I'll speak to my belief on it. You know, incumbency is a really powerful thing. And as I sit on a subcommittee for the county that's currently looking at election campaign finance reform, and I just remember in 2010, in order for me to unseat an incumbent, I had to raise about $48,000 to do that. And so in my mind, if the seat is really genuinely about developing leadership in your community and bringing people into leadership roles in the community, term limits are a good idea in some capacity. And we were trying to figure out what was fair. We want to be conscientious of the current sitting council. But in my opinion, it seems like 12 years or 3 terms would be a fair time limit for a council member. So that's my opinion on that, but that is the general direction of what the council determined. And as well as the mayor, we felt like if the mayor wanted to serve for 12 years, whether it was a 2-year or a 4-year term, a term limit for the mayor would also be acceptable for 12 years. Councilmember compensation. So this is kind of one of those things too that is uncomfortable to talk about and takes some political courage to say, hey, we want to talk about our compensation. It hasn't been discussed since 1985. I was 10 years old the last time it was brought up in council. So yeah, do the math. But ultimately, you know, when you're looking at the future of the city and how much the city has grown exponentially since 1985, $600 for council compensation in 1985 was much different than $600 for council compensation in 2018. And as we as a city continue to grow with the future growth area, the thought process on that was not to make this council seat full-time, not to have anybody, you know, making 50 grand a year as a council person, but really just to have a cost of living increase every year built into our city charter so that it makes sense and that somebody else on council doesn't have to address it 25 years from now. So it's a very fair and simple adjustment, but it was also something that I think we need to have some political strength to address because it's an uncomfortable topic, and I understand that. Performance standards for council members. This was just in the interest of transparency, really just having a job description. I've had a lot of people assume that our council positions are full-time and that this is what I do for a living. And really, it's important for people who are thinking about running for office to really understand what the job entails. When I was elected, I didn't know that it was paid. I didn't know that we received benefits. I just signed up to run and then learned about the secondary elements of it. I thought that the meetings were at 4 p.m. on Tuesdays and that was it. Had no idea that there was TAMSI, Monterey County Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Solid Waste Authority meetings, all the subcommittee meetings. And so I think it's really important just for the general public to understand what the job is. And so if people are thinking about running, or if people are wanting to know how their council member is doing, that our attendance records are up on the city's website. Lastly, let me see if I make sure I get everything here. And we talked about, did I get them all? Oh, binding interest and binding interest arbitration. The subcommittee just wanted some clarification on that in terms of what the role is of the city council and what power or lack thereof, I should say, we have in discussing binding interest arbitration. And so the subcommittee opted not to move forward. And if the community has an interest in changing the binding interest arbitration of the city between the city and the firefighters, then it needs to come from a community group. And I think that's it. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councilmember Villegas, any short comments?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. I concur with what Councilmember Craig stated. And the sticky thing was the mayor's term, you know, but we wanted to go forward with the term limits, 12 years, that would be applied on the 2018 election cycle and forward, not for anybody, you know, we're not going to go back 12 years and say, hey, by the way, you're done in 2 years. No, it's, you know, everything going forward. We're not going to do that and then your council people are going to lose their seats in a couple of years if they've been on there for, 10 years. That wasn't the intent. We wanted to be able to bring fresh ideas and give opportunities to, as Councilmember Craig stated, more leadership coming up through the ranks. Because in my district, I'm the first fresh voice that our district has had in almost 20 years before I got elected. I didn't know about a lot of the pay or anything like that council receives. I was running to, like a lot of people, we have some ideas and we want to go forward with them and see if we can make things a little better in our community. Then I learned about the things that the council receives for being on council, and one of the things was the council pay, and it is a touchy subject because it's uncomfortable because we're advocating for our own pay. I've never had to do that in my life before. You go to your boss and you say, okay, this is what you look at what you've done or what you're doing or what your responsibilities are, and you're compensated accordingly. Okay. Just if you do an inflation index calculator, In 1985, $600, you know, it would cost you $1,400 in today's dollars just to buy the same amount of goods and services. That's the buying power that the dollar's lost since then. And we're talking, what, 33 years now? You know, it is an uncomfortable thing, especially with the budget and everything, but I think the best thing would be is like what the military does, what the federal government does, is just a COLA, as well as the employees of the Salinas city. I think that, you know, that's something that should go through, and to me, it's a no-brainer to do that for, you know, people that are willing to serve and sacrifice on all these, on the council and all the committees that they serve on. I think that's appropriate. As far as the binding arbitration, yes, it was a voter-approved thing. It's going to have to go back to the voters. We agree on that. I think that is, any type of binding arbitration is detrimental to the fiscal viability of any public entity. I think that it takes a lot of negotiating ability away from council, and I think that council should have that back, because you know, in the last negotiating thing with the fire personnel, and you know, I have the utmost respect for them, but I think that it takes away from, it could be on both sides, coming to the table and being reasonable, seeing the numbers that are out there and what we can do as far as a city that we can reasonably afford, because these legacy costs are not going to go away. They're going to just go up, and I don't want to go to the point to where we have to lay people off. I mean, all the people we lay off, they're members of our community, whether they live in town or they live on the outskirts of town. They live in this the economy of the Monterey Bay. As far as the city charter, we would like to go forward with this. We'd like to have this, you know, council vote on it and get it passed if that's what it takes, or, you know, go to the voters to have these charter amendments taken care of. But I think that for the city, I think the term limits is a very good idea, and it will bring in new voices and new ideas into the thing, and, you know, basically, you know, force our community to build the leadership from within and build these people up that want to, you know, serve the public in a publicly elected capacity. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. I'll go to Councilwoman De La Rosa now.
Well, I have some disagreements with my colleagues in the committee. First, I want to say that my role model is Dianne Feinstein and Senator Pelosi, yeah. And also, I've been a councilwoman for more than 10 years, and I have to tell you, this is not a sacrifice for me. It is something that is in my heart to represent my district, which elected me, and they keep re-electing me. And you know what? I just want to say that I enjoy what I do. I really do. And I enjoy working with my city staff, and I enjoy going out in the neighborhoods. And I also enjoy working with other other agencies and the county. You know, right now we're trying to work with the county, and I really enjoy being, you know, part of the decision making. And I want to express that as long as my district, my residents keep re-electing me, I will probably run another term. And guess what? I have looked in my district for leaders, but I have to tell you, some people, they like to talk. I want to do this, I want to do that. But when it comes down to when you tell a resident that you have to go to so many council meetings, you are also assigned to certain committees, which you are expected to be there because you're representing the city of Salinas and your residents. I worked a full-time job. I just retired in December, and guess what? I had to take vacation time. I had to give up lunches. Why? Because anything that was happening in my district first, then the rest of Salinas, I would take a half-hour lunch from the clinics. I had very good supervisors, okay? So the community needs to know that before you want to be a council member, you better find out what your duties are as a council member. Okay, so that's another one. And then the second one is, I am in agreement on the mayor's every 2 years the term, but on the compensation, what would be the compensation? I think we need to go back to the committee and we need to have discussion on that. We need to find out how much compensation do some council members want. The term limits, I already said no term limits. Let the community decide. Let the voters decide. They look at what we're doing, believe me. Also, on the binding arbitration, let the community decide. The community members need to put this on the ballot. So there you go. So I think I've said everything. Did I cover everything? Or did
You did very well.
Well,
Thank you very
Mayor.
much. We're going to go down to Councilmember, where should we start? Davis, you want to start? And then we'll bring it back to Barrera and then back to the far end.
Sure. For my 2 cents worth, I'd like to see the mayor term limit be 4 years. I think 2 years and having it every 2 years is difficult. Something to consider, though, would be to either have it on a gubernatorial election cycle or a presidential election cycle. In politics and elections, you do realize that we do get a lot more turnout in a general election during a presidential election year versus a gubernatorial election year. But of those two, it had to be one of those. Given the time limits and time constraints, I think it'd be more, I think we'd be better set on doing it in 2020, if at all, or taking it another 2 years to 2022 and then changing it over, depending if the council as a whole wants it on a gubernatorial election cycle or a presidential election cycle. But 4 years, it is difficult running a campaign. I've done several in the last 2 years, and I'll tell you, it's not something you do because you enjoy having to be out there. And really, when you're running for public office, you have to do so in a way that you're totally unabashed, because your entire life is looked under at a microscope. So that, for anybody who does want to run for office, please do. I think it's quite an eye-opening experience if you haven't done it, to try it. And I think you have to have a little bit of crazy in you to do it. So whoever up here wants to agree or disagree with that. As far as our compensation is concerned, I'm fortunate enough and privileged enough to be compensated well by the taxpayers in my normal day-to-day job. But I can see how someone working minimum wage position who would like to be a part of a leadership position in the community is not able to, because of the time constraints that this takes. Just going to the council meetings alone, not including any of the other committees, in the 4 years it'll cost me about $50,000 of my own personal time off of work. And like Councilmember De La Rosa said, it costs money. I have to take time off of work so I can be here today when I could be at work, but this is important to me, so I don't do it for the pay. I do it because I love the community that I serve, and I love doing it for the right reason. I'm just fortunate to be in the position that I am, to be able to do it with the little compensation we do get. It's not something that crosses your mind where you sit there and you go, hey, if I get my $600 every 2 weeks or whatever it is, that's why I can do it. It puts a very little dent into the amount of time and the effort that it costs. And that's just doing the bare minimum, not going to meetings like the mayor goes to. I don't know how many meetings that guy goes to, but I'm very impressed. And if it wasn't because he was retired, and if he had a full-time job and had to go to his normal day-to-day job, this city wouldn't get the type of representation it gets on all the different committees, because he goes out of his way and he is everywhere. And so I will give him that kudo, and he does very well with that. And every other council member or council person up here has a lot of, I want to say collateral duties, but they get appointed to a lot of committees. And if it wasn't for them being a business owner, or if it wasn't for them being having their employer being very open to them taking time off of work in the middle of the day, they wouldn't be able to go to those meetings and spend hours and hours and hours at like Fora or TAMSI or whatever it may be. But it does take a lot of effort. For future council members, I can tell you that I'm not one to vote yes on my own pay raises, but I would be okay for it taking effect for whoever takes this seat next. So, but I think that it's something to be addressed, because I can see right now we're precluding a large portion of the population, especially in District 1, from ever wanting to run or being able to run for office because financially they couldn't do it. Performance standards for council members, I mean, that goes hand in hand with term limits, in my opinion. I used to be of the mindset that there should be term limits for everything, especially Congress. I still think at the federal government level, we do need term limits. But when you come down to our local cities and local supervisorial races, you know, really the power is with everybody out here. The power is with the voters. And if the voters become apathetic and don't go to the polls, then we get what we get. So who is it for me to tell you as the voter on how long you can have a council person or a councilwoman or a councilman representing you? It's up to that district and the constituency within that district to either had enough, seeing no change, and to actually casting a vote. But unfortunately, what I've seen in the last 35 years of my life, and the last 25 years that I can really remember, is that voters are apathetic. I mean, we had low voter turnout until just recently, when all of a sudden something becomes a major issue. And we see it every day in this chamber here too. When we don't have a normal segment of the population always coming out and being here and letting their voices be heard. But when there's a problem, when we're doing something up here with homelessness or something that really gets under the skin of the community, they come out in numbers and they let us know. Something I learned when I was on the union board, we would have union meetings and never have a quorum. Then all of a sudden something would come up and there'd be everybody there. So I realized when you're doing the right things the right way, nobody comes up. But when you mess up and you got a room full of people in here, then you're doing something wrong. So be happy that nobody shows up is what I learned, because hey, things must be going great. Because if you start irritating and you start getting under the skin of the constituents and you're not doing right by the voters and the people in your community, they'll come out and let you know. But we just need to make sure that the voters know and that they continue to vote and don't become apathetic. So for me to sit here and say, hey, you know what, Councilmember Barrera or Councilmember De La Rosa, who's been here for quite some time, or anybody else who's running term after term after term, who am I to tell that district you can no longer have that representative if they're the one who keeps voting him into office or voting her into office? So they need to be held accountable, and they need to hold their council member accountable, just like I should be held accountable. That's why I think the performance standards for council members and council member term limits go hand in hand, and we're held accountable by the voters. So I really am kind of torn between, yeah, we should have term limits versus not, because I think the power lies with the people. It's just a matter of the people using that power and casting their votes. But as far as compensation, yes, I'll never accept the compensation. If it was to pass today, I'll stay where I'm at. I don't think that's not why I did it. It's not right. But as far as the mayoral term, definitely 4 years. It's just a matter of when. Thank you.
Councilmember Barrera.
Good evening. My name is Tony Barrera. I'm running for re-election for District 2. Can somebody tell me how much this will cost? I mean, if the majority of the council approves it? Is the finance director here? Or can somebody tell me how much this will cost the city to bring it up in a general election?
Yeah, we don't have an exact amount, Councilmember Barrera, because it will be consolidated with the other items that'll be on the ballot. And again, it's by the number of pamphlets that get sent out and such. So any charter amendment costs will be folded in with the regular election costs.
So roughly, even for just a general election, we're talking over 100,000?
Councilmember Barrera, the last election, or at least our estimate, was $6 to $8 per voter the county would charge us.
So being that the mayor is good at numbers, more or less any idea at $6 a voter? Excuse me?
Was it $6 or
$6 to $8 per voter. So you can refer to the math. It's going to be more than 100,000.
Well, that's fine. Thank you. See, I would like, rather to spend it on election, I'd rather see $100,000 go for summer job stipends for our young people that need to build their self-image. And I really believe in summer jobs. I would like to see that money going to that instead of this. But let me get back to this. I do think that it is difficult for a mayor to run every 2 years versus 4 years. And I'm sure there's pros and cons on that. It's a difficult task running an election. I love elections. I like the boxing ring. But let me just share with you on this. I've been your council member for the last 12 years. I've missed 2 meetings. One was to bury my father. The second one, I ended up in the hospital. Other than that, I've been here, prepared, on time, and ready to do the people's work. I think term limits, the people will decide in District 2 whether I'm doing a favorable job or not. The last election, there was a young woman that ran against me. She came to my living room. She asked me for pointers. Knowing that she's running against me, I congratulated her and I welcome her, because you know what? And you might think I'm crazy, but every 4 years, people are invited to run in District 2 if you qualify, because it is the people's seat. Do I want to win? Absolutely. But like my colleague says, I think everybody should be given an opportunity to serve their constituency if they like. Every meeting, community meeting that I attend, I always encourage people. If there's some of you out there, I'm running for re-election in November. If you live in District 2, welcome. Because you know what? The more people that run, the better opportunities the voter has. And that's just the way it is. Again, do I want to win? Absolutely. Do I want to discourage somebody to look for mud? No. But the mayor's position, I think, it's a disservice to be running every 2 years. I think it should be every 4 years. As far as money, you raise as much money as you can. If people, remember, when you get money from people, the chip is coming, and they're going to hold you accountable. So be careful how much money you take from whoever. As far as, I believe the binding arbitration. What I understand, binding arbitration, and I see our new fire chief here in front of us, binding arbitration belongs to the voters. They were the ones that voted it in, I believe it was, 1985? Was that what it was? What I was concerned about, we just gave the fire department a humongous raise, as I believe we have. They get paid very well as the police get paid very well. But somebody said our hands are tied, somebody else says we're being held hostage, but we gave them a raise. So binding arbitration belongs to you folks. You're the ones that can bring it up before the voters if you think it's not right. It's up to you, it's not up to us.
It's 98.
What?
Sorry.
Since time I second that.
So I don't think we're going to eat today. So as far as the compensation, who doesn't want to raise? Of course, we all want to raise. But I concur with my colleagues. It's kind of difficult for us to tell you, hey, could you give us $1,000 raise? In San Francisco, I noticed San Francisco and San Jose were mentioned in our report as far as term limits. But the council member in San Jose gets, I think, $99,000. I think in San Francisco, it's like $127,000. Here we get, what, 600, $1,000, something like that, which is great. But I don't think none of us do it for compensation. I don't agree with this report, with these recommendations. The only thing I do agree with is that position of the mayor that it should go for 4 years. Thank you.
Councilmember McShane, the far guy on the left over here on the right.
I want to start by thanking the subcommittee for their work. I especially want to recognize Councilmember Craig. You brought up the need to look at the charter quite a bit of time ago, and I'm just glad that you've fallen through on that. And there's clearly a lot of work here, and to the city attorney, thank you as well. I think just walking through it, the mayoral term, I'm in agreement. I wouldn't change it. As for term limits, I think there's a lot of good in looking at it, no doubt about it. I guess I remind myself that we're not that big of a deal up here. When you talk about Congress or the Senate or the state assembly, maybe there's a little bit more play and influence. When it comes to local government, maybe we're just not there yet. So I see the reasoning, and I am particularly moved by Councilwoman Craig's argument on these points. I'm just not convinced that we're that big of a city yet. I think it's actually quite a bit easier to remove one of us than folks realize if we're not representing our district or doing our job right. When it comes to council compensation, I think that we have an opportunity every budget cycle to adjust what it is we take home. I realize it hasn't been adjusted in some time, and quite frankly, it's crossed my mind. How was that amount decided on, and where did that come from? And so now I know. As for performance, I think this is the heart of what's been discussed. And to Councilwoman Craig's points, there's probably a lot more work that could be put in there. And I'm generally supportive of really making sure that we're attending meetings, we're doing our job, that we're prepared for these meetings. At times it feels like I'm investing more in this role than I'm investing in my own business, and that's challenging. I don't know what it looks like from the outside looking in. I can just look at the city manager, and he gets a lot from me. I don't know if there's much else to say. If this is also a time to ask questions of the city attorney, I guess I'd be curious to find out what the next steps are, and maybe that's coming. But how much of this can be handled by way of our budget and or a future agenda item where we could expand on what exists already, I think, with our special sections in the city, what do we have, the code?
So let me just walk through each of these 4 things. The mayoral term is in your charter. The only way that gets changed is with a charter amendment. Term limits would be a charter amendment. That's the only way to address that. Councilmember compensation is a 2-step process. Currently, it's in your charter as tied to what state law provides. And there's a state law provision that sets your compensation as what it's currently set at, unless the population size of the city grows, because their compensation is tied to population. And so in order to change your compensation, we'd have to remove that provision from the charter, and then you could set your compensation by ordinance. So that would be the 2-step process there. You can't change it as part of your annual budget cycle. Performance standards for council members doesn't need a charter amendment. We can deal with that administratively through a resolution, through some other sort of mechanism that you all can deal with on any given Tuesday.
Can you clarify the state law provision?
Right, so in state law, there's a provision that sets council member compensation at the population of the city, and there are certain ranges of population at which a dollar amount is set. In order for you to get to the next level, the population of the city needs to grow significantly. Otherwise, you're locked in because of what your charter says, because your charter says compensation will be set at what comparably sized cities' compensation is. And so that's the only way that gets changed is through a charter amendment and then a change to your ordinance.
Okay. I guess here's another question maybe for the committee. It's a little challenging, and I know how schedules can be that you guys never got into the same room. I would have loved a report saying, we agree, this is what we recommend. Bringing it back to council, this is unique. And I look to the mayor because I know the mayor tends to prefer, something with a bow tied around it. The discussions happened in committee, we're here, there's agreement, and it's yes or no. I don't know how much time we have allotted. I'm happy to volley with Councilmember Davis as to whether or not it should be 2 or it should be 4 for the mayor. Or to volley with Councilwoman De La Rosa on whether or not we deserve term limits. So I'm kind of looking for next steps, recommendations. There's some good stuff in here. I don't know. I guess that tees up the mayor quite well.
I haven't commented on any of it, and I can tell you this. I think one of the things I would like to see is for the committee to meet again. I realize that it won't be on the ballot in 18. Let's get it ready for 20 so that we can bring it forth in 20 when we have the election. That gives us time to put a bow on this. As you say, I like to see things properly prepared. And then we'll see how it plays out. And then we can have a more thorough discussion. And we may even want to have, I know you love community meetings, this may be a time to invite the public in for their comments on this issue. And I don't think that would be such a bad thing. And I agree with both sides. I think the public decides who sits up here. And if you blink and don't do what they ask, sometimes you don't get to sit up here. And as some of you know, you've run against people and removed them from their seats. I've seen the list of mayors that have survived. They looked very young in their first pictures. And after about 6 or 8 years, so when people talk about 12 more years, I calculated my age. Mr. Callahan said he'd put a strap on me, a seatbelt, so I wouldn't fall out of the chair. So we have a lot more discussion on that issue to come. What I'd like to do now is, if you don't mind, I'd like to take it out to the public to see if there's any public comment on this.
Yeah. Great.
Nona Childress, 1 comment and 2 questions. First, I highly commend the existence and transparency for performance standards and really increasing what the public knows about what the commitment of these positions are and increasing public involvement. First question, is there anything that would prohibit, should term limits be adopted, somebody then rerunning for a second term instead of another 12 years after taking a hiatus to allow that fresh blood in there and to increase the training of our leadership? And second, how can we really, what other programs are there and publicity and education about civic involvement that would foster those leadership programs? I know you've got a great one for the high school and middle school students. Take it to the adult population as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Dominic?
Good afternoon. My name is Dominic Dursa. And first off, a discussion of term limits without a discussion of the limit on money is basically a scam. It's not bringing in fresh voices. It's allowing that stale money to have that same effect. Because even after 12 years, if you get somebody new, a new person needs that much more money to get the word out. And all it means is Don Chapin and all the other people, whether they're liberal or conservative, are going to be able to call the shots that much better because their donation checks mean that much more. It's a scam. It's an easy way to bait people and say, you hate politicians, get rid of them. Look, I admit I am a Democrat, and as a Central Committee, we have failed. As Labor, we have failed. We have not done what we should to make sure these voices are right. But it does not mean to just turn to easy answers. Furthermore, you do deserve more. The things you do should be compensated because we will never have a representation that looks like our city if the people who work here cannot afford it. And if we have term limits, these two will be that much more powerful because that institutional memory will be gone. City council members do not have staff. And I know you guys work hard to help them, but let's be honest, if you have rookies, your knowledge is going to be that much more influential. And I'll be harping on this later because 2 minutes isn't enough, but I think the mayor does deserve 4 years. Because a mayor who has to, again, raise that money, the money raising does not stop. A mayor who has to raise it every 2 years, again, how are we ever going to have somebody that looks like this city if they have to constantly raise this money again and again? I absolutely believe it should be in 2020. In the last presidential cycle, 40,000 votes were cast for president. In the last gubernatorial cycle, about 12,000. It favors the poor or the rich when you go.
Thank you. Your time is up.
Thank you.
Good evening again. My name's Al Espindel. I don't know for sure if I got it right, but evidently the committee did not meet as a group. Okay. I'm going to take them as you got them listed. On the mayoral term, 4 years almost has to be. It's ridiculous to have a mayor running every other year because of his time and the cost. Term limits for council members, I don't think so. We're the term deciders. If we don't like them, we'll vote them out. Council member compensation, you're doing fine. This is a part-time job. You don't need any more. Performance and standards, that's pretty common. That should be, no problem. Binding interest arbitration, people voted it in. They don't want it, they have to vote it out. Like I said, put it on the ballot. One of the things I wish there was up there is how to get a person out of office. Recall. What's the process for that? Does that go on the ballot? Is it petitions? We need to know that too. So if the committee meets, put that as part of your discussion. Thank you.
Wharton again.
Who appointed him?
You're going to wish I stayed home. As one I've heard from several years ago, councilmen and mayors, that after 12 years, you begin to own it. And he says, and that's no good. But as far as mayors, I think our mayor should be no terms. We should hire a mayor, or someone go in and say they run for mayor, but as a permanent job, not as a part-time job. I mean, our mayors, whether they have regular jobs or not, are all over town, and they still have to have a job to support their family. This is ridiculous. I mean, the last 5 mayors I knew, except for now he's retired, had to go after 10 and 11 o'clock at night to go back and do their jobs. That's not right. Their family loses everything. Term limits, you just heard me. It's up to us, really. But I mean, like I said, these were personal things that mayors and council people told me, that we shouldn't be there more than 12 years. Performance, we should have some kind of, how many times you missed and what. And the binding in arbitration should belong to us. But I think our mayor should be a person who's paid full-time to do a full-time job. And I believe, even though that things have changed through years ago when we volunteer, because you volunteer for this job. But I know the meetings that you go to now and the meals you have to pay for these things, yeah, we should be reimbursed for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, get back to council for quick comments. And you know my opinion about taking it back to the committee, so you're going to have to make the decisions if that's what you decide. We do not have to vote on this tonight, so.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Craig?
So I'll speak on my end in terms of, as one of 3 subcommittee members, I'm happy to meet again. I understand and hear the concerns of the public and the council. And certainly, if it's not in 2018, it can certainly be in 2020. I don't want to say there's no rush, but I do think that we do need to address it. It's an uncomfortable topic. And I just want to make clear that what we brought forward really has nothing to do with the individuals on the council, on the dais here, and everything to do with the future and the leadership of the city. And so, I got asked by the media, is this, a way to try to oust? And there's literally no political agenda other than trying to address some really inherent issues that we've had as council members for the last several years. I do want to just speak briefly and acknowledge that the political sort of scam, or the term that was used, honestly, that is not the intent. The intent is to make the seat open and available to whomever. And it speaks to Councilmember Davis's comment about when you have somebody in a seat for a long period of time, or Councilmember Villegas's point, when you have a council member in a seat for a long period of time, it makes it very difficult to run against an incumbent. And so making that seat available every 12 years opens up the opportunity to a wider array of people within the community. And that is the only intent of that topic. I'm fine. I appreciate the dialogue, and it's good to hear, not having the ability to speak to other council members and really sort of airing out concerns. And we worked really hard to ensure that, we didn't want anyone to feel like we were ousting or that we're trying to take a money grab. I would say meeting again is perfectly fine. I'm inclined to give some level of clarification on compensation as well. I was thinking more like cost of living increase, or through the consumer price index, like 2%, which is $12, by the way. It's $12 a month for a council member. And so, identifying some really manageable but really long-term solutions as 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we can address some of the inherent concerns. So That would be my direction to staff. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Villegas, any comments, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I agree with bringing it back. If we need to do another meeting to get that anything hashed out, clarified, and we understand there are there's no panacea as far as fixing things here and there regarding term limits or not. There's pros and cons for not having them, and some of the people at the podium brought up some very good points about it. But as Councilmember Craig stated, our intent is to not have the all-powerful people in office for 20 years. Bring in the new voices. Give people, give others a shot and with their ideas. And one of the things, that was one of the things, and also with the mayor's limit or term, the mayor shouldn't have to run every 2 years. I think everybody on this dais can agree to that. And and as far as the COLA or whatever, however form it comes out as far as council pay. The voters should decide. Let them decide. I'm okay with all that. And like Councilmember Davis had stated, it makes it very uncomfortable to, vote for your own pay raise. It shouldn't be like that. It should go to the voters and let the people decide, and let them, their voice heard, and have them come up and let us know what they think as far as what we're proposing for these changes in our charter going forward. And I think that's very important because that will give us some direction. And, it may come down to where, they don't want term limits, okay? And if the voters don't want it, then, hey, I'm okay with that too. I don't agree with it, but I'll be okay with it. All righty? But that's pretty much it, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilmember McShane.
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement with Councilmember Craig. It's just the term limits. I'm not convinced of that yet. That's all.
Thank you. Councilmember Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Something I'd like to see, since it seems like it's going to be going back, but Mr. Dursa brought up a good point, is campaign contribution limits. And I think if we're going to have a conversation about term limits, then we need to have a conversation about campaign contribution limits. Something in point on that I'd like to see is a two-tiered system. They have it in many jurisdictions. For example, $500 per individual, $1,000 per couple, or for a business or for a PAC, something similar to that. But we have to keep in mind that if we do push that, then there could be some unintended consequences of PACs and political action committees having a little bit more control and power over money in our elections. So it's a double-edged sword, so to speak, but I think it's worth having that conversation as well. As far as the pay of council member compensation, instead of attaching it to COLA, if we could look at attaching it to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. I see more and more labor negotiations going towards, instead of a COLA, into a CPI, and that means that it can go down. So you can actually, if the Consumer Price Index goes down, then your pay will actually go down as well. That may be more appropriate for higher legislative offices, but I think it's important that with whatever the voter decides, to recognize that if our economy is not doing very well, then there's no reason for us to stay at the top as far as our pay, that it should be adjusted lower as well, and not have to go back to the voters to approve a pay decrease for its council members. So I'd like to see something fair in that can adjust both ways in that manner. I think these are some good ideas. I'm still on the fence about term limits. I see both sides of it, but definitely campaign contribution limits is something that, and if you don't feel that should be all pushed into this one proposed update, maybe splitting it apart, because I don't think campaign contribution limits has to go through a charter agreement. I think it's a mere ordinance, if I'm correct. So that might be something that we bring back at a later time and have a separate discussion with a different committee. I do have one quick question for Mr. Callahan, because I was unsure of it and it escaped me, so it either wasn't important or was a lie, as my dad would tell me. But as soon as it comes back to me, I'll email you and let you know. Thanks.
Councilmember Barrera.
Mayor, I always think if, there's been a good dialogue with the council and the public. I think even though the committee is going to meet again, maybe they can get some people from the constituency as well and bring something solid back, and you know it's coming from the community as well. Because, you know, I've learned sometimes because you appoint a committee, sometimes we get a little bit offended because we do put in a lot of work in it, and we don't want to be questioned sometimes because we have put a lot of work. But I think bringing in people like the commissioner as of today, he's a commissioner right now. We can bring some of the people from the community and go along with that. Thank you.
Gloria?
No, I'm fine with bringing it back to the committee and trying to meet together, the three of us this time. I don't have a problem. You heard what I had to say, so I don't have a problem with 4 years if that's what we would like for the mayor. So let's bring it back to the committee and go forward.
Thank you, I got that. And somebody brought up a good point. We don't have to bring, I think campaign financing, I think Councilmember McShane, Councilmember Davis, and Councilmember Barrera will be appointed to that committee to put something together and bring it back to this body. And I think they should be, this is a very good opportunity to see where we stand on that issue.
Mr. Mayor, a point of just clarification. The county is already going down that rabbit hole, so we may want to wait and see what they're proposing. I know they have researchers that are looking in other counties on campaign finance reform and have like a researcher at the Naval Postgraduate School working on it. So it may be something that we could not necessarily reinvent the wheel if the county comes forward with something.
Well, if the county comes forward with some major, like $100,000 for office, I guess maybe. That's, you know, I know they're pretty serious about campaign funding over there based on their last current supervisors races. We can do that. But the committee can look into it, maybe reach out. I can't wait to hear them have a smaller number. Not going to happen. But so I want to thank everybody, and I want to thank the committee, and I want to thank everybody's perfectly honest input on this item. And I know that there was a lot of angst, and people were looking at each other rather dramatically when we started talking about term limits and things like that. And we'll see how it comes back to this council and the public's input. So I thank the public for this input on this.